A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. This week, that would be through Chapter 13. Through Chapter 13. Hey there, this is Cross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
So, Crossland, we are pretty far ahead on recording. We've been intentionally front-loading our recordings. But I'm pretty sure this is the last time we're recording this year.
Yes. Yeah, we actually worked through the schedule. This is our last recording of 2021. Good call. Did you have some thoughts on that?
No, but this is going to be I guess my one thought is this is going to be our first full year where start to finish, we released an episode every single Thursday.
It's a fair point. And at least one a week. We occasionally release two.
Yeah, that's true. So, but feels good, man.
In some crazy weeks, 3, because we were insane at a certain point. Yeah, it is so great to have made it to this point, and to all of you listening at home, whether you are new to the show and listening because we've moved into Mistborn or been with us the whole time through Red Rising and onward and upward. Thank you, cheers, and Happy New Year.
I guess we drink to that, huh?
Yeah, drinking to that. So, with that, I believe today is our 74th episode, and it is our 4th episode discussing Mistborn, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, and we are going to chat about chapters 9 through 13. But before we do that, first, let's talk about what we're drinking. PJ, what are you having on this fine, snowy, windy, wintry evening?
Something perfect for snowy, windy evenings. I made eggnog. So, recently, How to Drink, the YouTube channel, released an episode on eggnog again. And I took the recipe from that episode. So half an ounce of maraschino liqueur, half an ounce of simple syrup, 2 ounces of bourbon, a full egg, dry shaken, and then add ice, shake it again, and then strained, and then I just garnished it with nutmeg. I think he garnished it with good. It's also not like... I think he makes a good point, or a big point, of orange zest as well, but I didn't have an orange, so. It's nice and light and creamy and tasty. I like eggnog in general, so this is really good.
Whoa, so you effectively actually made your own eggnog. Holy shit, that sounds great. I'm going to try that. That's sweet.
I think he makes a good point, or a big point of it in the video, so I won't rehash it too much, but a lot of the store-bought eggnogs seem to be more trying to represent Tom and Jerry, which is more of a batter, so it's way thicker. This is more...
like a custard?
Yeah, this is less like that. This is a lot thinner. I don't know. It's good.
Huh.
Really good.
I will have to give that a go, because I'm a huge fan of eggnog, and I actually haven't had any this season so far, mostly due to schedule and not thinking about it each time I'm at the grocery store. I'm always like, I've just been efficient and haven't shopped around or spent time to like look at stuff. So, wow, that sounds awesome.
I completely missed a part of that. After straining out of the shaker, top it with about 3 ounces of whole milk.
Okay, got it.
Yep.
I was it's just egg. Interesting. But no. milk makes sense in
milk
there.
goes in there too. So... I fucked up in writing the recipe.
No, and again, not that big of a deal. I was just thinking about it. I'm like, really, it's only egg? Weird. And, saying that there's milk in there, it's like, okay, all right. So it's a little bit creamier. Like it is what I imagine it to be mostly, as far as a mixture goes, really. So that makes sense to me.
Sorry about that flub right there. Definitely added the milk in my glass. I just didn't put it on the recipe sheet. So
no big deal. What are you following that up with?
I have a beer from Modest Brewing Company out of Minneapolis called Liquid Strata Crystals. So double dry hop Strata New England IPA.
Nice. So
yeah,
that sounds delicious. Have you tried it yet?
Nope. Yeah, entirely Strata, top to bottom.
Okay. Cool. Because of the day that I described in kind of our little Devil's Cut segment, I basically rushed in home after seeing the new Spider-Man movie, immediately made the easiest, quickest, and drink that I'm the most familiar with, all of the ratios, a old-fashioned, pretty classic, pretty straight up. If you've listened to the podcast, you know our old-fashioned design, but basically 2-to-1 bourbon to simple, 2 dashes bitters, and a little orange peel.
Perfect. So yeah, this has been a crazy couple weeks. So this is absolutely your go-to when things are crazy. So I think you've done this a few times in the last couple episodes.
I think it slipped into some other episodes. I think in Mistborn, I've mostly been deliberate in trying to avoid it. I know that in like episode 2, I had a screwdriver. Episode 1, I did the Survivor of Hatson drink. Episode 3 last week, I did a modified summer old fashioned, I called it, which was bourbon to orange juice to orange bitters to amaretto was kind of the mixture there. But I think in literally every other show that we did, I had an old fashioned. I think in any other show that wasn't a made Mistborn, like wasn't a words and whiskey show, I had an old fashioned.
Right. Okay. Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah, it checks out. I'm following that up with a beer from New Anthem Brewing out of Wilmington, a voice in the midst, spelled MIDST, not MIST. But you can imagine why I picked this, of course, because of the sort of similarity to Mistborn here. On top of that, the beer is double IPA with Simcoe, Centennial, Cascade, and Columbus hops. I haven't tried this one yet, so
all right,
just give it a rip real quick. I just got that on my phone. That'll be fun. Oh my god, is that good. Wow, holy shit. So, super duper tasty, flavorful, warm tropical notes. I'd say even like a hint of pineapple, like just in a small, subtle way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yum.
So I've got liquid strata crystals open right now. It's fine. Nothing crazy, nothing bad. A little bit more bitter than what I'm looking for. A little bit less flavorful in general. It falls a little bit flat in that respect, but it's good. Other than my minor complaints, so yeah. Yeah, not a whole lot to say there.
Cool. Sweet. Well, with that, we are going to move into the episode. Generally, we would move into predictions, but because of the crazy week, I still haven't had time to collapse them. I will collapse them all, though, for our 5th episode that we're doing inside of the series, and we will get to every single gosh darn one of them, you know?
All the ones I'm right.
All the gosh darn ones. Obviously, we will address the ones that we are immediately aware of in terms of predictions, because there are a couple in here that we definitely get some answers to. But yeah, we're gonna talk through that. So while we get this rolling, we start entering part 2, Rebels Beneath a Sky of Ash. We start off chapter 9 with our usual, a little journal entry here, and the first one is very short. I'll read it here. In the end, I worry that my arrogance shall destroy us all. Fairly vague, but
I'd say so.
Any thoughts here?
I think going forward, we'll get more and more off of this person. But for now, at this moment, I have thoughts later, and I'll address them as these journal entries hit, but at this time, like reading this for the first time, still no idea.
Right. The immediate impact of this one is like, okay, so you think you're a fuck up. Like you believe that you yourself are fucking up in some way, shape, or form. And that's got an interesting thing. But of course, you know, I don't expect a whole lot out of this one. But the other ones, this sort of adds a little bit of flavor and back text, even what we've been talking about week over week. So we'll definitely have to discuss the implications therein once we kind of get to the point where you felt like you broke and when you realized what you think you realized.
I think that's the next one that we'll talk about. I think that's into chapter 10.
Cool. So we'll talk about the implications here for sure by the end of the episode, but it's an interesting little bit.
Yeah.
So we cut to this really fantastic training scene that follows us between Vin and Kelsier, and it's really spectacular. It shows her growth for one and gives us a vague idea that time has passed between kind of the different parts here that we see. What did you think of our little training duel that we seen between the two?
So more than anything, I felt like it was fun to see the combat between the two Mistborns, as opposed to that sort of one-sided fight that we saw Kelsier like facing off against all the guards, but seeing projectiles getting like swatted away and chasing each other around, like this becomes essentially just a chase scene, which was sweet at the same time, but it was a really satisfying experience to read because it was so much more than just a one-sided fight from a foe that you can't really do anything about, you know?
Right. There was none of that imbalance of which was definitely present in the raid on the Venture Keep, and that kind of presents itself in this very interesting way, especially as we move into this kind of new section and showing how complex Mistborn combat can really be, as opposed to the very, I think you said it great, the one-sided nature of the previous, arrangement. It's fairly great.
Yeah.
So after that moment of combat, those crazy kind of interactions that happen between the two, learning each other's tricks and kind of experiencing those different things, I particularly love, this is the moment in which Vin drops the coin bag and tricks Kelsier, right? And he brings that up later as he thought that he was being trailed and like borrowed that trick, which shows that Vin has this like natural predilection to sort of the way that Mistborns think already, which is fantastic.
Yeah, she's tricky. She's really tricky.
Yeah.
Like, she has a lot of instinct and has picked up on, like, her entire life, as far as we know, has been running and hiding and taking on jobs for thieves' crews, and growing up in that sort of circumstance and getting as far as she has, you're going to have to pick up on, like, little things like that constantly. So we get a lot of flavor from Vin throughout a lot of this section, but here especially. This
just reminded me of this for whatever reason, but there's an old quote from the Farscape TV show that says, "I'm just going on gut instinct," and one of the leads says that, and that is, it almost feels like that's the definition at this point of Vin's interaction with her abilities and kind of the way that she's pursued a lot of different things. She's jaded by her trauma, but on top of that, she's learned a lot from what's happened to her and what's been kind of visited upon her. And it's fantastic to get that perspective on, these kind of, what would you say, like translations between skills almost? Like, she's been able to translate a lot of her thieving identity into being a Mistborn at this point.
Yeah.
And into acting the part of playing Lady Renew a little bit later as well, which we'll definitely talk about.
That one is definitely a lot more labored as far as remembering to do things, but
yeah, she's definitely having a tougher time doing that than she is playing the part of a Mistborn, but it's definitely still interesting. We return to Mansion Renew and meet back up with Sazed as well as Kosan and begin to shape Vin's hair to prepare her for what's to come later. But during that process, Sazed also talks about religion and recommends one specifically for her. What do you make of the religion that she recommended, that of the Thousand Stars, and also the depth of knowledge that Sazed possesses as this Terrace Keeper?
As far as I know, this religion isn't actually rooted in anything in our world, but I would absolutely believe that it was. If you were to tell me that this was some ancient religion on Earth, I'd absolutely believe it. Like, that, I think, speaks to the depth of, not the depth, but the care that's taken in writing these sort of background things. It seems to be done really elegantly.
I'm not saying that he's taking from a religion, but he's taking from religious conceits, right? And this idea that the 1,000 eyes are better than the one sun, and in that sort of conversation that happens is a fascinating one, and you can really understand why they would be grounded in sort of in a very real way, in the way that, humans, religion is often a tool through which humanity has tried to understand reality and beliefs and things of that nature. And so this feels like trying to understand the reality of the red sun versus the thousand stars in the sky, and kind of understand that, like, the brother of the 1,000 stars is better and brighter than the one kind of egotistical sun. It's just so interesting, Like, it's such a good little conversation here. What about Sazed as Keeper?
I was going to say, like, as far as the rest of the religion goes, how topical it is to the idea of questioning the big one, questioning the one ruler, like, versus all the other voices in the equation. I'm sure there are more elegant ways to articulate that, but I don't have that off the top of my head. So I'm just going to continue stumbling and go right into Sazed as a keeper. And as far as my thoughts go, I'm mostly curious about the method that he talks about for, like, memorizing things.
Okay.
Like, I can't remember the exact quote. Like, he has his ways or he has his techniques or something like that. I think techniques might have been. Like, we know from later contexts that he'd be a formidable adversary. It doesn't really go into whether or not he'd be a good fighter or anything like that. But we know, like, people would... how do I describe this? I think Kelsier explicitly says something along the lines of you wouldn't want to, like, cross him because of his status as a keeper. And that's vague as to why, and I'm curious, man. I'm excited to learn more about it.
You know, what's super interesting is we're talking about this right now, and as I mentioned before, this is really my second and third and fourth pass through the series. So something while we're just talking about this just clicked in my head. That is a massive thing, and I can't talk, which is wild, but it just like clicked, and I was like, holy shit, and I had a revelatory moment, and I can't talk about it, but I want to let you know that is the way that this book series works.
All right.
Oh, God. Fuck. Okay, so, you make a great point about the power of Sazed as a keeper and kind of the idea of these different techniques and sort of the depth to which he exists.
Is it a hive mind thing?
Well, it appears to be, right? It gives off that appearance of a hive mind thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
right.
There's definitely that is a potential for this to exist that way. Because he does give context that there are many keepers, or that there are at least a couple, and that the Lord Ruler despises them a little bit later. We get kind of that context. And so the idea of a keeper is a very interesting one, and it brings about like another kind of, fantasy progression here for the story, which is really interesting and unique. I realized that I derailed my own very complex question because I had a moment, and that was weird, but we're going to move on. After admiring the haircut, we cut over to a conversation between Sazed and Kelsier discussing whether or not they believe her to be ready for her test at a ball among the noblemen, as well as her innate elementic skill, while perhaps leaning on the other Mistings to train in their specific disciplines because Kelsier does not have enough time to do so himself.
I'm pretty sure this explicitly is a prediction that the training would be delegated to specified or specialized members of the crew. Yeah,
you definitely predicted this. You said this, actually, which is why I was like, oh my god, you're right, but you're also a little bit wrong. Like, you didn't give enough credit to Kelsier and what he was going to try to do. But you were right in the way that this was obviously going to roll out, and literally the next chapter focuses on one of these elements. So cheers, I'll drink to that. Cheers. For you getting it right. Typically, this would be on the front end of the episode, but drinking in the middle, it's great. Honestly, if we got really good at tracking these, drinking in the middle of the episode might be more fun, playing it as a drinking game that way.
I agree. I think it would be.
Yeah, we just have to figure out exactly how to do that, and we can make that work. But yeah, it comes true here, and it's a very interesting, satisfying moment, right? Where it's like, oh, we believe in her, and she has this innate ability, and it has this she can do all these things, but I can't teach them all to her. And Sazed, of course, leans into that idea of everyone else giving her little bits and pieces here. Beyond this being a prediction, did you have any other thoughts or feelings?
Oh, I did have one thought. I thought it was really kind of odd that this thought never even, like, that idea never even crossed Kelsier's mind. And I don't know if that says something about if he's just distracted, or if he feels like he should be the one to entirely take this new Mistborn under his wing and teach her the ways, or like what it could be. Like, if that's how he was taught, so that's the way it should be taught, because he has his teacher that he refers to, and I can't remember his name at this point. But I just found it that thought never crossed his mind. Like, you have all these high-level specialized Mistings. Why not utilize them for training?
It's definitely an interesting thought, and I guess maybe that's because he himself is fairly inexperienced. Doesn't he say something along the lines of, like, he's only had the powers for a couple of years, maybe at most?
Yeah, I mean, he was in the pits of Hassin, like, 2 years ago.
Yeah. Gemmel is the name, by the way.
Gemmel.
Yeah.
Which we don't know anything about Gemmel, right?
No, yeah. We get no information outside the fact that he trained him in the pits of Hassin, in theory. It is interesting, and I think that this really speaks to kind of Kelsier's own naivete. He does have this perception of feeling like he knows everything, and I think it's because we kind of swap between perspectives of Vin and Kelsier. We also don't get like how shaky Kelsier is because he's kind of new to this, and we get a little bit of this information, interestingly enough, from Marsh, where it's like, you're not like this generally, so like your weight here is a little bit different. But
so maybe less naivete and more arrogance.
That's better. Arrogance is right. That's definitely fits in, especially with the quote at the top of the chapter that like double fits.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. With that, we go into chapter 10. We lead off, of course, with another journal entry here. I'll read it off here. It amazes me how many nations have united behind our purpose. There are still dissenters, of course, and some kingdoms, regrettably, have fallen to wars that I could not stop. Still, this general unity is glorious, even humbling to contemplate. I wish that the nations of mankind hadn't required such a dire threat to make them see the value of peace and cooperation. There's seemingly like a lot of context tucked into this one. What do you think?
So this is where like something clicked with you before, and it's going to be hilarious if I'm entirely wrong, because I'm just going to go off on this like for the rest of until there's something else that tells me that I'm dead wrong. I'm going to run with this. This is the Journal of the Lord Ruler.
Okay.
And it was written in the past. I don't believe we know of any other nations at this point in the story. If there were other nations in existence, I feel like that would come into play as far as the resistance goes. There's a dire threat unifying them, and I'm pretty sure that's the deepness or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in general, to kind of speak to your point, it is referred to as the final empire, right? Like the world itself that we find ourselves in the modern day is referred to as the final empire.
Yep.
So that feels like it fits. The only other nation we've even been vaguely introduced to is Terrace as a thing.
I saw that less as a nation and more as like a cultural body, but
sure, yeah, and that also makes sense. Like that is also the context. So it's because they're referred to as the Terrace people, the Keeper, the Vots at one point is another term.
Yeah,
cool. So you think it's the Lord Ruler, Journal of the Lord Ruler?
I'm absolutely going to continue with that train of thought for the foreseeable future.
I'm curious. Have you gone back and reread?
I have not.
Earlier journal entries? All right.
But I want to.
I'm curious what you'd think rereading those with that lens, what that would lend you. But maybe that's something we'll address next week, now that you've kind of had this thought. I realized when I was editing this week's episode that I got really good at muting myself in Discord each time I had to cough so that you didn't hear it, but I didn't mute the mic, so it didn't fucking matter because I still had to edit it out. It's like you didn't hear me cough, but the recording still did, so it didn't fucking matter, and I had to edit all of those out. It was awful.
Funny.
It was hysterical and awful.
That's really funny.
How I felt. I was like, oh, this is punishment for being dumb. Got it. All right, my bad. All right. With that, we cut to Vin back in Luthadel, walking down the ashen streets under the impressive red sun. I like this as this little environmental reminder here, kind of at the beginning of the chapter. She's here to receive her training from Breeze on the art of soothing, which starts with a little nugget about the importance of understanding emotions and when to soothe and when to just maybe play into ego a little bit and kind of other elements of personality. What do you think of this?
I really like Breeze. He's such an interesting character.
Breeze is so cool, so interesting. Right.
But he maintains this high level of confidence even without the use of his suit.
He feels like a nobleman. You know what I mean?
He does. He does kind of lord over people to a certain extent, which is, I mean, to a certain point, he straddles sort of a line on morality.
Yeah, right. Commanding personality, line of morality, that all fits.
Like the wine right at the beginning here. And the fact that he's so cavalier about like, I could be using my allomancy on you. Who knows? Either way, give me some goddamn wine. He's such a dick about it sometimes, but in a way that's okay, I guess. Like, he's absolutely an asshole, but I don't mind it.
Right. He's not. It's one of those odd things in like comedy and humor, right? Where he is like a dick, but he isn't really like punching down in a serious way. Like he's not actually demeaning or like making people diminutive. It's more of more in jest, and it's well executed.
The point with this one that's less in jest is that, like, he's drinking their stores of wine that they definitely can't afford. And it's just like, oh, Kelsey will pay him back later.
That feels more like a sort of blow off. This actually specifically reminds me of Doc from Firefly in an odd way. Okay. Where, like, Doc would occasionally do things and be like, Mal will take care of it. And be like, you know, like, I'm the old guard. I'm one of those guys. He knows what I need. And it just reminds me, it's Doc, right?
Doc.
Bronco, the religious guy.
Booker?
Is Booker, that's it. Holy shit. I haven't watched Firefly in a long time. It's totally Booker.
Okay.
But yeah, so Booker, same point, though.
Okay. Yeah.
We're like, Booker's like, yeah, I mean, we're old friends. He'll take care of it. He knows what's needed, what's necessary. Gives me more of that sort of mental thought.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, we get a lot of Breeze here, but we also get Ham, who is here as well. And he asks, of course, as our philosophy guy, he asks a great philosophical question. Is overturning the final empire ultimately a good thing or a bad thing? And we love Ham. We love Ham because he facilitates my part of this podcast.
Yeah, there is one sort of issue with this entire thought experiment, though.
Sure.
And it is going on the supposition that the Lord Ruler is God, or at the very least is enough a part of God to be able to define morality. I don't think I buy that, and I don't think a lot of them buy that either.
You're making a very Nietzschean point right now, which is to say that, like, God is dead, and even though, like, we even are perceiving... No, what I'm saying is, like, God is dead because we are being fed the information that this is God, but we do not have an understanding. Okay. We cannot perceive what God is, and we can perceive this man, and we can perceive what he's capable of, and therefore he cannot be God, because God is imperceptible.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is you're making a Nietzschean argument, which I agree with.
Sort of, but more so, I'm making the argument that his entire point is contingent on them believing the Lord Ruler, and just accepting that he's God.
Yeah, it also has this element of kind of like double think to it from 1984, right? Like, it's got this element of, like, because the foundation of your belief prevents you from seeing further than your nose, effectively. And that is kind of Ham's problem, is that he does have this assumption of God. And that's what also, like, Vin tries to kind of debunk actively with, like, kind of her joking, shrug-offish way. And Breeze likes it and kind of laughs at it. But I think it's serious, and I think that she's not entirely wrong. She's also, at the same time, grappling with her own beliefs and trying to kind of get an understanding there. So it's an interesting quandary to be stuck in the middle of.
Yeah, that's fair. Definitely. But I disagree with Ham entirely. So
yeah, I mean, Ham is just there to make arguments, dude. Like, that's kind of a fun part of his character.
That's fair. It is fun.
You know, like, regardless of whether you agree or disagree, he is just there to have the conversation. Like, and he'd love to play chess and move the pieces around, even if it doesn't mean anything in the end.
Yeah.
We also get an interesting detail here as well regarding both soothing and rioting, that they're actually very similar, of which you also stated, of which I will take a drink for in a second, except at the extremes of emotion. I think that this is a very interesting distinction, all things considered, in the same way that iron pushing and pulling are very close together, but are distinctly different. Soothing and rioting are almost identical, with a couple of exceptions.
Yeah, so the way it was kind of described, and it really made a lot of sense to me, was the sort of idea that I was kind of thinking of it like colors, like pigments.
Oh, really? You were thinking about colors?
I was.
And you're going to try to explain colors to the colorblind guy?
I am. Okay.
Just want to make sure.
You understand sort of the principles of how colors work, right?
Yes. I get it. Yes.
And just sort of the idea of emotions being a mix of a bunch of different core emotions, and being able to sort of play with the sliding scales. You can achieve very similar results by just increasing a bunch and leaving some the same, or decreasing a bunch and leaving the other ones the same. It's not going to be perfect or identical, but it can be pretty close, the way I was thinking about it.
Yeah, right. Everything is very similar until you hit kind of the poles, and that's where it becomes a very different thing, because often emotions are in the middle, which I think that's a great distinction.
Right.
But then, of course, we see soothing at work, right? Like, what did you make of this operation that Breeze is obviously executing with his soothers and the signals to them in turn? The scene is just so fascinating. I love it.
It is. I'm going to make more comparisons. This felt like Breeze was sort of a conductor, an orchestra of emotions. It was so like centralized and just, I don't know. I was imagining him like sitting in this like room obscured from view, sort of moving his hands up and down, and I know he wasn't, but that's how I imagined it.
That's actually a really good read. I really like the idea of him being a conductor of emotions, because it's very clear that he doesn't need to say out loud what he's doing, but he's doing that for the benefit of Vin. Right? Like he could execute this all silently. There's no actual somatic component, as any D&D nerd would say. But it gives off this sort of, I think conductor's a perfect word. He's in charge of this whole thing. He's got it on an operating line, and he knows exactly how to manipulate emotions. Reminds me of the way that a movie score manipulates your emotions, generally. Like, most movie scores are designed to manipulate your emotions as whatever's happening on screen changes and adjusts, and that is exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, definitely.
But without music, which we're getting through color perception of feeling to execute, and like these color signals going across the crowd, and that being really kind of the work of the soothers. So yeah, it's good.
So how were the different, that's the one thing that I was a little bit confused on. And it, like, I was listening to this a bunch of times, but inevitably I'd have to like re-listen to it because I'd be like working and getting distracted. So I might have just missed something entirely. But what was the point of the different colored servers that were walking around?
So the different colors, when they walked out, were signals to the other soothers to push a certain emotion.
Okay.
So it is literally like conducting in that way.
Yeah. So, I was thinking it was the other way around for some reason. Like, they were walking out as a signal to him, but that didn't make much sense to me. I mean, it was a signal to him to change, but they were directed by the general pacing that they had set up. So consider it's all a paced movement. It's a plan. It's a dance of sorts, as Breeze might even recommend. It's great. I love this scene as a representation of what a soothing is really capable of. It's so fantastic because a lot of times magic systems, occasionally like hard magic systems like this, can spend a lot of time explaining and showing a thing, but like, the showing feels false when you like come to try to understand it. Like, it feels like, okay, this information is being thrown down my throat because I need to know it. I need to know it for something that's coming up. This tutorial
feels natural. And yeah, exactly. It feels like a tutorial. This feels natural and proper and like really wrapped in story and character. It's great. Of course, in the middle of this kind of orchestra that we've been talking about of emotion, Kelsier is using this meeting in part to drum up his own legend and create this symbol and rallying cry to gather around, being that he is this survivor of the pits of Hath Sin. It's both affecting as well as effective, but not to the degree that the group really needs to be in order to continue recruitment at the level that they need to hit the number that they're expecting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a balance going on here that is absolutely working against him, in that he can't really say a whole lot, and Vin points this out, I think almost explicitly, the same way I'm going to, like, almost verbatim. But he can't say anything that's going to cause anyone to, like, that can be used as fuel to rat on him.
Right.
And because of that, he can't really give the juicy bits that are going to persuade people to join him. So he's effectively handcuffed himself, and as a result, he gets like, what, 20 members or something like that? Or was it like 5?
I feel like it was 20. I feel like that's right. They said that they've been getting like a little over a dozen or two each meeting, and it's a lower number than they want. And increasing the total volume of meetings isn't necessarily going to increase the recruits, because they also pose risks to themselves. So there's an interesting quandary that kind of goes on. It takes
time to set up the meetings.
Right. And they can only do so much vetting, and this could become a thing that would alert obligators and likewise to their presence. So they're at a tough balance point to your point. It doesn't feel like they can push much harder based on what we kind of get from feedback a little bit later. So Kelsier monologues for a moment about Atium. We get more on the actual effects of this metal later, but more now kind of on the economics of the whole thing. Where do you suppose the Atium goes? I'm going to flag this as a prediction.
Yep, as you should. I don't think there's a stockpile of Atium anywhere, because I think the Lord Ruler uses it, because we learn later on what Atium does, but what we haven't seen are huge amounts of a specific metal in use. And I'm curious if there's like, if you could use a ton of it all at once, if it would give you almost like divining powers, even more so. So I think the Lord Ruler uses Atium in fucking giant quantities as a means of maintaining power and sort of knowing the happenings of the entire realm ahead of time.
Okay. That's an intuitive proposition based on what we know from Atium a little bit later. Do you have any other thoughts there?
I mean, I think the reason behind it, other than maintaining a stronghold, is sort of the feigning of godhood, like the ability to perform miracles to anybody who gets close enough to potentially like need something more in order to stay a believer. I don't know all the specifics yet. I'm toying with this idea, but my thought is Atium is used as a tool to feign godhood for the Lord Ruler.
Sure. I dig that as a concept. And it's so interesting that you use the word feign, because you are already lending yourself to not believe that the Lord Ruler is in fact a god.
I absolutely don't believe the Lord Ruler is a god.
Interesting. What do you think he is, if not a god? If not a god, what is he? You did, in the first chapter... In the first section and in the third section, you kind of reaffirmed your idea that like he was insurmountable and kind of stuff like that. In the second, you questioned it a lot, but I'm interested to hear more.
I don't know. To anybody that's new, hi, my name's PJ. I make predictions and I forget. My thoughts and my feelings on things are entirely based on like my immediate feeling, like my whatever's surrounding me. So I will absolutely I think this happened more than a few times in Red Rising. I would make wild predictions that came true and completely forget that I ever made that prediction and be surprised by it being true.
Yeah, there were a couple of times that happened. So it's a fascinating process, but it's interesting to see kind of your like almost dichotomous approach to this character.
I do remember having doubts about the godhood aspect of it.
Right.
But I don't know if that thought ever really manifested in anything tangible at any point. I'm sure I flip-flopped a couple times.
Yeah, I was going to say it's more flippy-floppy, not solid. Are you suggesting that you're placing a spike in the ground?
I'm staking a flag.
All right. The Lord Ruler is not a god.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Neato. That's going to be a fun little prediction to have for a while. He also mentions that the name Critic Shah is a terrace name, that for the Hill of 1,000 Spires. But beyond that, he also speaks with Sazed about the Lord Ruler's seeming fear of the Keepers. What did you gather from this kind of interesting conversation that happens between the two?
So I think part of it is the extensive knowledge on religions, like topically to this section. The knowledge on religions could be used as a source of, I keep wanting to say disinformation because of us watching Chernobyl, but that's not like the right term. But the source of dissenting opinions, I guess, of truth. Okay. The source of anti-Lord Ruler propaganda. Does that work?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
That makes sense.
So topically to this section, I think that's what's going on. But in general, he fears the Terracemen for some reason. There's so much we don't know. There's so much we don't know about the Keepers, and I want to know more because I'm positive that I'm missing like a huge puzzle piece here to really understand what's going on.
Isn't that so interesting about the difference here between authors that we've read before? It feels like we have deliberate puzzle pieces missing, and we're just waiting for it to like click in place in its own way.
Yeah. That's true.
Between Crouch, between even Chuck Wendig in the short story that we read, and Pierce Brown, like all this is a distinct style. It's so interesting.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Yeah.
It's ripe for predictions, but almost
it is.
There's almost too much of a void, and it's hard to make like I'm just shouting into nothingness, trying to like make connections that are way too far apart to be made.
Sure, as far as you feel them, right? That's
right.
Sort of the reality.
Yeah.
I also every time I see Critic Shaw, it's KS, right? Those are my fucking initials.
It's K Shaw.
Yeah, K Shaw even, which is worse.
KR Shaw. We had this conversation before. We had almost exactly this conversation before. I can't remember if it was in the show.
Every time, like we talked about the kind of villainhood that's around the Shaw name in general, and it is just reaffirms it every time I read it that the family name is fucked. Anyway, we end this chapter with a brief catch up about where the crew is with planning their various portions of the heist before Kelsier is informed of an incident at Camon's lair. What did you think of the status update that we get from these folks?
I think my favorite point was the stifled "Are you insane?" from Yedin.
Yeah.
Yedin.
Yeah.
Yeah. All in all, though, in general, I really like the dynamic of the crew. I'm excited to get to know more of them better, but there are some big personalities and some fun quirks between a few of the members, and it's exciting. Good dynamic.
Cool. I totally agree. I don't have wild opinions on this. It's just so... It's so fun to kind of like see them regroup basically after like kind of seeing the way that they broke apart on the blackboard, and then seeing them come back together and be like, well, we are behind on troop recruitment. This isn't quite working out. This isn't quite working out. We don't quite have the weapons. We don't have, we're missing components here. And of course, all of this ends up being kind of sublimated by what goes on in Camon's lair. Sublimated. Did I use that word correctly?
I have no idea.
Divert. Yeah, I did. Fuck yeah. All right. Sweet. All right. Chapter 11. Our prophecy for this chapter reads, "It seems Rashek represents a growing faction in terrorist culture. A large number of youths think their unusual powers should be used for more than fieldwork, husbandry, and stone carving. They're rowdy, even violent, far different from the quiet, discerning terrorist philosophers and holy men that I have known. They will have to be watched carefully, these terrorist men. They could be very dangerous if given the opportunity and motivation." So this kind of sets an interesting painting of the terrorist people so far as we understand them previously, as we kind of get our understanding from Sazed and the Keepers, and the pictures of the journal kind of seem to clash directly against each other. What do you think about this?
So I think this is one of the first one that I noticed, at least, that this is definitely written in the past before what we're dealing with now, for sure.
Okay.
Because of the way these terrorist men don't have any sort of, like, it seems they don't have a grasp on what their powers can do, whatever those powers are.
Okay.
And it seems like in the present day, in the story, they are full aware of it, and people around them are full aware of it, and also they're hunted. So it's not like they have like just open congregations of them. So I don't know. It just feels like the precursor to what we know terrorist men to be so far.
Yeah, it's not, and I think precursor is an interesting thing to key in here, right? So now we're starting to place the assumption that this journal happens beforehand. It's a journal of the Lord Ruler, kind of like you'd made assumptions there. Right. And that leads us to an interesting place of like, why have these people been hunted? Why have they been removed? Why does the Lord Ruler see them as a threat?
What are these powers that they have?
Yeah, right. It's like, interesting for sure.
They're used for stone carving. What? That seems difficult to do. I don't know.
Right. It doesn't seem like it's easy. I don't know about you. I've never carved a stone.
I have. It was a very small stone, and it was just kind of like scraping shit into it. Not the same.
I mean, it seems as though there's definitely some removed information here.
Yeah, definitely.
From there, we find ourselves back in Camon's lair, as we kind of talked about in the previous chapter, but it is an absolutely brutal scene with people of Milev's crew rendered into bits, bones, and blood. It's a dark, stark moment inside of this chapter, and one that Kelsier intuits had been done by a Steel Inquisitor, of which there are noted to only be 20 inside of the Final Empire.
Yeah, that was interesting. This is absurd, though. It is a horrifying amount of carnage described here.
Yeah, it is. This is a strange, abject spoiler that's kind of distantly connected, but do you remember the carnage as it was explained in Daniel Green's Breach of Peace?
Yes.
This is reminiscent, I think. Like, my brain thinks that these scenes are similar.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Anyway, that was just like my first impression was like, this reminded me of that.
So are you saying that the Steel Inquisitor is...
I am not further suggesting any other connection to Breach of Peace. I am just intuiting the sort of violence that we see, the display that's kind of here. But still, the Steel Inquisitor and the carnage everywhere.
Yeah, it's horrifying. So much blood. So much blood.
I mean, the blood, the bones, the limbs kind of flayed everywhere and splayed against the walls. Like, this is a grotesque scene to walk into.
What does she talk about? Like, I think she uses the term thorough.
Yeah.
At least one point.
And that feels like a very clinical analysis from Finn's part of like trying to not internalize so much of this, because she does ultimately like recognize Ulef and other components that are strewn across the room. Yeah.
All right.
I'm specifically using that word because that's kind of the way that this scene is described. It's awful. It's horrifying. It's bloody. It's egregious.
Bits.
Bits. Ugh. It's not violence for violence sake, but it's enough of a shock to make us realize how terrifying a Steel Inquisitor might be.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Are you afraid of them now?
Not necessarily yet, because we don't technically know for sure that this was just one Steel Inquisitor, right?
Well, we don't.
Vin is adamant that it had to be more people. I know. That's the point that we're trying to make.
That is literally the sublimated point. Right.
I know. I'm just gotta be. I gotta play Vin's side too.
You got to play the contrarian a little bit, which is also Vin in this circumstance. So I feel that. Mm-hmm. We of course kind of leave this moment of sort of the bloody brutality. We live in it for a little bit longer, I should say. And Sazed brings up a religious rite to help ease these souls into the afterlife. And I find this moment that he has with Vin in this scene where he says that his like faith in every religion is almost kind of like a comforting, warm blanket about the truth of human existence in its own way. This idea that beliefs are contradictory at their basis, and they have these biases naturally kind of built in, but that they all kind of they're all composed of like grand theories and assumptions. And his kind of acknowledgement of that, I think, is so critical to the idea of why people put themselves and believe in religions. And this is just such a unique moment in so many stories that it feels important to remark upon.
Yeah. It's a really unique perspective. And it's hard to tell, like, he doesn't believe in all of the religions. It's like his religion is the religion of people, and what gives them comfort and what gives them closure. And anything like that, regardless of if it's true, it's just finding circumstances and finding related passages from whatever religion that could ease those tensions or thoughts or whatever the circumstances are.
I have this interesting conundrum that I think about a little bit with Sazed's perspective here, and it's that I always have this slight feeling he almost aligns more with philosophies than religions. Mm-hmm. Like he's almost playing into it more as like a philosophy, but obviously it's a belief system driven by gods and other things. But it feels,
I got the vibe that
so close to philosophy.
I got the vibe that was entirely philosophy, and he was just borrowing whatever relevant passages from past religions.
Sure. Yeah. But he's so strict about the idea that he believes in them all, and that like he understands a God's application, and that makes for this interesting kind of crosstalk between religion and philosophy, because they are connected. They always have been fundamentally, and it's only recently Nietzsche basically being when that sort of postmodern philosophical debates started to enter the conversation were really fully separated from religion. But it's interesting, nonetheless.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of I don't know. I really enjoy Sazed's perspective here.
Me too.
Mylev, of course, bears the worst of the brunt here. He was slowly tortured, made to maybe give away information on the crew themselves, being that the Inquisitor still had Vin's scent from her first meeting with the Obligator, as it appears. We don't actually know that, but that is the situation that everyone assumes we found ourselves in.
Yeah, it's fucking brutal. First of all, not even the brutalest of what we'll see later in the chapter, but I'm really curious on what Vin's actually thinking here, because I could see it completely going, and she kind of shows aspects of apathy, of remorse, of guilt, of, I don't know. There's a lot of different feelings, I feel like, and she does a really good job of not really showing any of them. But just her inner monologue at certain points is like, all right, so she cared about them, but she didn't care about them. And she's not reacting in a horrified way. Like, she's a tough one to crack, man.
Mm-hmm. She is interesting, tough, difficult. You can put any number of phrases on it. She is rock solid in the way that she has been traumatized, right? Like, she is almost impossible to pick through.
Yeah, basically.
Like, what do you even do? What do you assume? What do you try to... She's the toughest nugget to crack inside of this whole story, which is also... It makes her a fantastic character because she has these traumatic experiences. She has this sort of orphan legacy throughout the story and makes her an interesting character. Mm-hmm. So from this moment, of course, that we find kind of the brutalization happening, Kelsier comes to this realization, seemingly kind of keeping it from us, but he splits from the group, who, for the rest of them, they head back to hide at Clubs' lair while he goes off and searches for Camon. We arrive with Vin surprising Kelsier at a shocking scene of the man's disturbing murder. Perhaps, seriously, one of the most gruesome deaths I've ever read in fiction.
I don't know about that, but it's pretty fucking bad. Like,
I mean, the hook goes through his mouth and through his throat. Like, that is...
Yeah, but it's... Okay, it's not described in the most horrifying way. You know?
No. And I would say, if anything, like Sanderson is a little bit light on metaphor and details and things like this, mostly because he doesn't want to kind of make a point of it, but just the sort of simplicity of describing it in this very like base way is also a great way of just making you like have to sit with it, which is bad.
I don't know about that. Because it gives you the opportunity to completely like gloss over it if you want to. You don't have to pour through it and really get the nitty-gritty details of what's going on.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that's definitely what he's aiming for in this entire chapter of brutality. Is like it's not meant to like shove it in your face. To quote an author of whom I've worked with a couple of times, being transgressive is really easy. Like being transgressive in fiction and writing and things like that. It's a very easy shortcut to getting you to kind of base your emotions in people, but it doesn't lead to serious residual feelings, if that makes sense. It doesn't like make you feel invested in a real way. And I think I agree with that in the most part. I think that it gets the point across without being too much.
Yeah, I can see that.
Especially as it's specified as this sort of like ritual killing. Yeah.
Yeah. I did like the description of hanged in not the ordinary fashion. I can't remember the exact term.
I'm pretty sure that's what it is, because it's the hook that goes into his mouth and then up through his back, like up through his throat, like a fishing hook would.
Yeah.
And that alone is enough to like think about the way that would position a person, right? Like he isn't describing what that would lend itself positioning wise, but he's leaving enough there for you to sit and linger in it and be like, oh, that means he's kind of like, he's hooked. He's sitting there. It reminds me of some of the depictions of... Yeah, right. I also thought of the Mitch Hedberg joke. But I also get the depictions of like BioShock in certain contexts where like people are hung kind of in grotesque ways and kind of made examples of by other splicers instead of that story. And it reminded me of that in kind of a big way.
Yeah. Yeah, I can get behind that.
We also have see kind of the differing perception of beggars throughout this section, and that also is kind of painful to bear and paints a larger picture of the ska as a whole again, and kind of gets back to the grounding of world building here. And he's looking for Camon, of course, because he's among those beggars. But
so that's one thing I was kind of curious about. He was essentially forced into becoming a beggar by design. Like he was told, go become a beggar over here. What's stopping him from, I don't know, tapping some of his old contacts or anything? Or does he not have any? And it seemed odd to me that Kelsier forced him into begging in this specific location and had any way of enforcing it, you know?
Well, that was the, like, ham checkups, right? Like, there was a little bit of a note dropped that, like, other people had checked in on him.
Yeah, okay.
Inside of the kind of muffled conversation that was happening in the other room that Vin was trying to listen in on. So he was being checked in on to ensure that he was kind of put in place, which is also its own interesting torture. Also, worth noting, Camon is a piece of shit and also deserves this death in its own way, but it's also brutal, and
yeah,
he deserves death. He didn't deserve this death.
You can't say that.
Yeah, well, right.
We don't know that. You may have.
It's impossible.
You may have deserved worse.
Right, it's true. It's impossible to mediate specifically on what he deserved, but this feels simultaneously for Vin, like she feels like this is just desserts in its own way, but also is kind of like afraid of the consequences. It's a tough thing to parse.
Yeah, it is.
With that, let's move into chapter 12. So we start off, of course, again with a little journal entry here. What would it be like if every nation, from the Isles in the south to the Terrace Hills in the north, were united under a single government? What wonders could be achieved? What progress could be made if mankind were to permanently set aside its squabbling and join together? Is it too much, I suppose, to even hope for? A single unified empire of man? It could never happen. There's no way that you escape this without having an opinion on it.
I mean, my first thought was, okay, Napoleon, but I mean, of course, this is the Lord wrote,
right?
And I don't think I can't see any sort of progress being made in this world. Things seem pretty regressive. So,
I mean, you're right.
I don't know.
It's just painful.
Maybe it was too much to hope for a good reason. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we might see unfurl. Over time.
Mm-hmm.
These sections continue to be something that I cannot talk about, but like want your musings on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. All right. And I'll talk about them as much as I can, but I don't want to either. We kind of have discussed this during the previous series, but my goal is not to mislead you intentionally. It is to provide a sounding board.
I'm well aware of that.
With your current location. I know that you're aware, but maybe the listeners aren't.
Okay, yes. So yeah. For some context, early on in this show, I don't know if we ever actually even released any of those, but you would have me predict things and intentionally like drop fake predictions. Or not
I did that a little bit in Red Rising. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think you did early on. Where it wasn't like you were actually misleading me intentionally, but you were just kind of letting me.
I was taking extraneous details and like making them a big deal for maybe no reason. Yeah,
right, exactly. So we've had a couple conversations on that, and I think because basically it got to the point where I was like thinking too hard about those details, and it was like ruining my reading. Like, what's going to happen here? Right. And it didn't matter because it never got addressed again. So after a couple of those happening, I think we've gotten it dialed in as far as what you pose to me, not necessarily being super important, but not intentionally being unimportant.
Right. I would agree with that. It's more meant to, I'm pointing at things that may illuminate and may not. And I'm no longer trying to mislead you into imagining other plot directions necessarily, but instead imposing a question that is more founded in the text that leaves you with an open-ended area to respond to.
Right.
So, generally speaking, I'm leading you with the text as opposed to leading you without text. if that makes sense. Like
exactly.
Sometimes I was making shit up, just to see like where your brain would spiral.
And it spirals, man.
And it spirals.
Holy shit, does it spiral?
A couple of times, but now it's more about like using the text to see where your brain spirals. So
Yep.
Yeah.
Which I appreciate.
So inside of chapter 12, we cut from that initial segment into Vin preparing for her very first ball, having conversations about expectations with both Sazed and Kelsier. Her goal is to find people who are interested in her and note them in her mind. She's also to relay any rumors she and Sazed hear to Kelsier. This is such a cool segment. It's so good. It's like even just the conversation that happens in the carriage where like Kelsier lands on top and like jumps into it's just neat. It's a good time.
It's pretty neat. This is just great subterfuge shit.
Yeah. Right.
And that's the other thing is there's nothing particularly unique about this entire section,
Mm-hmm.
It's just so well executed. And it doesn't become cliched at any point. It doesn't become... I mean, there's one point where it's... I don't know. The premise is a little bit... Because it happens... Because it is just generic spy shit, that it's... You have to get on board with it, but... He brings you on board super. I don't know. That devolved into like me not really saying anything,
Yes. Yeah. You quickly spiraled off into not saying anything specific about anything.
Yeah, it did. But I just felt like this was really well executed, even though it's not a wholly unique premise.
Yeah, this is again an example of Sanderson's flawless execution on the part of kind of the heist trope at large that we kind of find here, and it's a refinement of a lot of those things. And it's not as though it's wholly new. We've experienced this kind of thing before, and again, this book was published back when we were in middle school. So keeping that in mind, like. Things have changed dramatically over time, and our understanding of media and literature have changed, and I'm sure the public's perception of media and literature have changed as things like Twitter and Reddit have grown. So there's this interesting kind of dynamic that's being played with here that I'm not saying that this feels dated, but it feels of a time.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know I don't know how you can delineate between dated and of a time, but I get what you're saying.
Like some things feel pre-internet specifically because like the information is so limited and like characters aren't able to understand, and in turn like writers can't understand the complexity that might come there as they're predicting the future, like science fiction in particular. This feels still like a timeless heist, but taking tropes that they were tropes, but they weren't widely understood as tropes. Like the public understanding of tropes wasn't as well defined.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So at the time this seemed less tropey. Now it feels very tropey because we've had an extra, 14 plus years.
Yeah, that's fair.
Actually, is it that old? For some reason, I feel like the Mistborn is actually only a decade old.
I mean, we graduated high school 10 years ago.
I know. I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying, okay, July 2006. For some reason, there was a leather-bound 10-year that was similar to the Elantris 10-year. Anyway, we're good. I was not wrong. That's all that matters.
That is all that matters. You're right.
I'm just kidding.
You dick.
Yeah. So, and then we get to the ball, right? Like it's such a cool moment. It's one of those things that I kind of like eye rolled at the first time that I read this kind of idea of like going to this ball and being like this regal event and everything else. I was just like, oh, this isn't my fucking thing. Like this in a very Pierre Ford honest context. I was like, my God, this does not fit my taste at all whatsoever. But then as it starts to unfurl, I'm like, okay, I'm far more interested in this than I should be. And we get this really interesting and complex depiction of upper-class noblemen. And I think that that's kind of great on the part of the society representation. We from like the dinner to the suitors to the musings of Sazed, it's all wonderful. What do you think?
So I approached it with that same mindset of like, oh God, we get to like sit through this ball. But I didn't even have like a moment of warming up to it. For whatever reason, I was in like right away. I loved it. I loved the way that it went like right away. So I don't even remember how it starts specifically. I don't know what grabbed me, but for whatever reason, I was invested. I was invested in this ball.
It's such a strange thing, but the lights right off the bat where she's like, she can't explain why they're so bright and why they're like lining this road, this like street with like these bright lights. And she's like, why are they doing that? That doesn't make any sense. It's to like glamorize the approach to the house. And she's not even used to the idea of a keep and the idea of like something formal like this. And I think that's what really got me is how it's familiar to us, but it's so foreign to Vin that we kind of feel hooked in part by our lack of understanding of exactly what a nobleman ball is, but also in Vin's utter lack of social comprehension of what this thing is that she's walking into.
Yeah, it's great. I think this is also where we get the point where they describe the limestone being heated to the point where it glows but doesn't melt. Is that here, or is that a different point?
That's a little bit later. I believe that Sazed specifies that when she's talking, or before she's like looking out over the balcony, or something near that is when that comes up.
Okay. Yeah. I think they are inside already at that point. But
yes, yeah, it sounds right. And she's peering out, and he's like, I don't know why they're able to burn so brightly, and specifically like why they work that way, but they do, which is interesting considering how much Sazed knows. It points out something that like speaks to the idea that maybe Sazed doesn't know everything.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I never put that together. He does mention, I don't know why.
Yes, he specifically says, I don't know why. To the point it says it, though, it's not as though, again, never spoiling forward, always talking about present things and trying to like bring these things up. So it's great that clicked for you, and I have those moments all the time inside of these novels, and my fear is always, I don't want to click advanced knowledge for you on accident, but sometimes present knowledge I know, and I can like bring up and be like, well, presently, like we know that Sazed appears to not know everything because of the context we get. So, yeah.
I mean, maybe he invented this technology and he's just like playing it cool.
A fucking liar. Yeah. Either way. So what's also interesting about this is Vin ponders this giant glass depiction of the Lord Ruler and the deepness. What did you think of the depiction of the deepness and kind of her feelings surrounding this depiction of the pair?
So in this moment, Vin had a lot of the same thoughts that I did, but from a different point of view, I guess. The what was it part is kind of what sticks out for me. She seems to know all of the stories of like the deepness, but still doesn't actually know what it is, and is like confused about being depicted so abstractly. Whereas like I haven't heard almost anything about it, and I'm still wondering like, what is this shit? But not necessarily like, why is it depicted so abstractly, but like, what is this abstract thing I'm looking at? Yeah.
It's especially like, interesting because she is the surrogate for the audience, but she has slightly more, she's got like 10% more understanding of the world than the audience does.
Yeah, that's true. It does bring up is it Mitch Hedberg? I think it might be Mitch Hedberg again.
One of the best comedians in the world.
What if Bigfoot is blurry?
Yes, that is a Mitch Hedbergism.
It's not so much why is this depicted as abstract and more as what is this abstract thing and how can I understand it better? So it's just kind of approaching it from two different directions, and who knows what the reality is. But that said, going into the tangible side of what she's looking at, I love stained glass, and I completely understand the awe that it can inspire. Like she talks about just the grandness of what's being presented to her with the sun behind it. And I remember, so I went to a Catholic university my first time going to college, and there are a few old buildings that I would have classes in that would have amazing stained glass like scenes, and it was always so cool to just admire them during class. Thankfully, none of them were like my science or math classes, so I could actually stay on topic with those ones. But, you know.
To that point, there was an interesting, I think it was an article or perspective, something that I listened to the other day that said something along the lines of stained glass was ultimately invented as a way of educating kind of peasantry on religion through pictorial storytelling, because it was so rare to have like pictures depict storytelling in any concept that a lot of people could see. So effectively, religious sects were really the first ones to depict these things in picture, and as such, people were fascinated because it was a form of human communication and storytelling. And so I agree with you. I have a profound reaction to stained glass. I think stained glass is A, beautiful, B, artisan, C, complex, and tells a deep story. Like, it is truly a unique thing. Like, regardless of your feelings about any particular Christian church, for instance, you can walk into a number of Catholic churches and see fantastic stained glass that tells, at the very least, a story visually. Often the like stages of Christ on the cross and whatnot, like those are the typical renditions, but it is always art, regardless.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and I think that's what Brandon Sanderson is trying to get at here with this depiction, is this kind of loose understanding of a concept that has been told and repeated, but not real deep understanding, which is kind of what's being reiterated through a perspective, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Because, like, we don't know what the deepness is. Vin doesn't have a fucking clue, but she vaguely understands what it is. We vaguely, as people raised in the Catholic faith, PJ, I'm going to pull on both of our youths here, we vaguely know what angels are. We don't really know what they are, if they're real. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's all about those vague conceits and concepts.
Cool blonde white dudes with trumpets, right?
No, that's actually not the way that the Hebrew Bible describes angels, and the way that the Christian Bible.
That's the joke.
They're actually multifaceted creatures with a ton of eyes. No, I know. I'm going off for people who don't know shit about angels. They're much more Lovecraftian than you assume, which is wild and also freaky. But yeah, we move on from kind of this depiction of kind of the religious ideology and symbology that we see here into an interesting one that's a little bit of a different spin. We see a little bit more of what obligators do here as Vin listens intently into a conversation. What did you make of their position within the noble society now that we have more information? Not perfect, but more.
I still don't have a firm grasp on what they do, but in this context, as far as I could tell, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm way off, based contextually, like if I missed anything, let me know. But they seem to act as notaries for these parties. So like actual business can get done and verbal agreements can be held with sort of a higher regard and can actually be like, they can act as contracts. Like these verbal agreements, just chatting somebody up at a party can be a binding contract with this obligator notary.
It's actually great that you compared them to a notary, because I didn't want to draw that connection necessarily, but it is entirely accurate. It is very much, seemingly from the perception that we get here, they kind of fill that position of notary and carry some sort of political, religious, social weight that we're not sure of yet, but they do have enough to like hold sway over the noblemen. I think it's Vin who says something along the lines of the noblemen watch the ska and the obligators watch the noblemen. So there's this interesting hierarchy of people here.
Yeah, almost circular, but not really.
Yeah, is that all you have there? I mean, you don't have to have more. I was just leaving it open.
So it's an interesting dynamic, and it really depends on what capacity these obligators are there in. Are they hired to be there by the people throwing the party? Are they sent there by the Lord Ruler or any other minor ruling dignitary? Like, what are these? What capacity are they there in? It seems to be out of convenience, but at the same time, with that passage, they're also there as a check.
Right.
So I don't know.
They're a check in a number of ways. They're a check in the way that like the economy is not being manipulated emotionally by allomancers or mistings or Mistborn variously. They're a check on maybe like there are hints of other things that could be controlled by obligators, and calling them a check it reminds me of, it's not really the biggest of spoilers, it's very vague, but like of whites in a way. These are much more formal whites from the Red Rising universe.
Okay.
In my own mind, you know what I mean? Like they're the judges. They're kind of lawyers. They're notary, I think, is a great term to attach to them.
Yeah.
So we move from there to Vin stumbling into something very unique. As she stares across the room, she sees a face, a persona that she recognizes. It is that of her father. There's a really sad note here that further portrays the pain of Vin as her status is that of an orphan child. To quote, Reen had taken Vin, sneaking her in, insisting that she at least see her father once, though she still didn't understand why. And that is such a profoundly sad idea to, as a kid, to us, obviously, foundationally, as people who grew up with their parents and whatnot, like it is a foundationally sad idea to seek out that kind of orphan parentage and like not have any respect, knowledge, or care for them when you first see them. And I don't know, this is such a tough part to parse, but it feels so, ugh.
I've got a couple thoughts here. First and foremost, this has to be like a whole bucket of emotions for her. Like, I would have expected apathy or even animosity from her at this point, but it was much more internally confused about her own feelings, I guess. Like, we didn't get a lot of tangible, actual feelings here. That said, that passage about, like, from Reen insisted on at least seeing her father once, though she still didn't understand why. Something's weird about that, and I don't understand. That seems, from what we've heard about Reen, uncharacteristic of him. And I know we haven't heard a lot about Reen, but everything seems to be a lesson. So to have something that she's still confused as far as why doesn't seem characteristic of Reen in general.
It's oddly empathetic or sympathetic, right? Like it's got this interesting, like, why would Reen want to show her this?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It does have that it leaves an odd taste in your mouth of like, okay, from our understanding of Reen, he's an orphan child who knows more than Vin does and has been through a lot more of kind of the shit, as we might think of it right now, because he's older and so he has a better grasp or understanding, but then passes on those awful, terrible, abusive lessons to lessons, end quote, to Vin through his own perpetual generational abuse of sorts that he's experienced, and in turn, then switches to this very almost dynamic or empathetic or maybe sympathetic understanding of fatherhood, of family, of parentage, and the important therein. And that's odd. It's out of character.
Yeah.
Not like fully out of character. Like, I don't believe it's wrong, but it lends us to believe maybe there's more to Reen, even though he's not a character we interact with.
So, yeah, I had a stranger idea.
Okay. And,
man, there's a few of these points in this section where you get PJ's conspiracy brain coming out. This was just a random dude, a random obligator, that Reen had some immediate ulterior motive to point out, quote unquote, their father.
Yeah.
And had, like, deeply affected Vin as far as, like, knowing who her father is, but didn't actually mean anything and wasn't the truth.
Okay.
I don't know.
I dig. I'm going to leave that there as your prediction.
Yep. Sounds good. That might be a long-term prediction.
So, shortly thereafter, out on the balcony, we're introduced to a young man who we find out to be named Elend. What do you think of this literate little scamp and his aggressively anti-house venture opinions? Of course, we learn at the very end of this chapter that he is Elend Venture, which also lends an interesting perspective on the whole thing.
I'm really not sure yet. I get a really strange vibe off this guy. This is another point where conspiracy brain is going to come in. My instincts are to not trust his disposition right now.
Sure.
I feel like a lot of those statements wouldn't have been made if he was just talking to any unknown dignitary at his house. Like, it seems like he wouldn't have said anything, like talking about beating the ska too much or something like that. I feel like he wouldn't have said that without knowing that the person he was talking to would have been agreeable to it. So I think, here we go again. Like I said, I think he's playing the long game. I think he knows, at least to a certain extent, what or who Vin is somehow. No idea how yet. And he's going to exploit that and try to get Vin to trust him.
Interesting. Okay.
Doesn't it seem out of nowhere how, like, perfectly in line with her he is? It's almost too perfect.
In line, you mean in the way that he's
in opposition to his own house?
Sure. Okay. It does seem ideal, but I think especially given the reaction that we get later from some other characters and like Sazed's reaction even at the end of this chapter, it is one paints this as a problem, right? Not for his kind of idealistic viewpoint.
That's a completely different issue, though.
Well, I know what I'm trying to sort is, thinking from a story construction perspective. We've got an idealistic problem. We've got someone who appears to like line up very directly. It lends to an interesting kind of blend in the middle. His motivations lining up with hers is, I don't feel like it's problematic so much or convenient, which I don't think you're. That is, I'm stretching your definition to get it to that point, for sure. But it does feel to have this hint of, wait, what? To it, if that makes sense. Like, right. There's definitely a question posed inside of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's also what the kind of chapter is going for, right? Because she being new to court and whatnot, it feels like he's playing up into her being new to court, and that's kind of the reaction
that's a good point.
He's looking for, because she doesn't really he knows that she doesn't know who he is in theory, because she's new to kind of this court situation, and he's been through so many of these things that he's jaded to the idea, and is just sitting there reading on his own fucking balcony in his coat that has a well-worn book pocket, which is such an interesting like little descriptive thing that it's like, yeah, fuck, this guy is like a reader and like a nerd by all intents and purposes, or for all intents and purposes. So it's an interesting like character dynamic, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's a tough to describe thing, but I don't feel like it's overdone, if that makes sense. It feels on the nose, but not overdone.
Right. Yep. I don't know. Maybe I'm just naturally untrusting. I don't know what it is.
When you're thinking about fiction, it is actually crucial to be naturally untrusting. Like it is an important thing for a reader. Like being naturally trusting, reading as many books as you might over the course of your life. Never trust the fucking author. Like everything is meant to sublimate, like to supplant your expectations. So. Trying not to say sublimate, make that my new fucking word.
Yeah. Gambit.
It's not my new gambit. I've not said gambit since the first episode of this podcast series. But I did intentionally plant that in the first episode.
I figured. Yeah.
Yeah. With that, we move into chapter 13, which I would add the subheader, basically Atium, the chapter. It covers so much, and so it's a short chapter, which is, again, why like I appended it here kind of at the end to kind of leave us on a cliffhanger going into next week. But on top of that, it is peak Sanderson in its own way, wherein we get an in-depth explanation as to something that we need to know in the world, but at the same time, things still move and things still actually happen. And it's peak Sanderson. I don't know how else to explain it. Before we get into that too much, though, I want to read, of course, the journal entry at the top. I know that I shouldn't let a simple Pac-Man perturb me. However, he is from Terrace, where the prophecies originated. If anyone can spot a fraud, would it not be he? Nevertheless, I continue my trek, going where the scribbled auguries proclaim that I will meet my destiny. Walking, feeling Rashek's eyes on my back. Jealous, mocking, hating. And this is really like, to me, it's a lot more color on our author and Rashek's relationship.
He calls himself a fraud here, or she, or they, or whoever it is.
Yep.
Very explicitly do not have a gender for this character yet.
Yeah, we have a vague idea that the Lord Ruler is a himself, he, but we do not have a gender for our journalist.
Right. So, going on the supposition that this is the Lord. My thought is, at this point, calling himself a fraud, he is already able to use Atium So here's where my gap in understanding in the lore goes, and I can't remember if it's been described yet or if I'm making this up based on the name. But at this point, seemingly the mists don't exist yet, aren't pervasive, and therefore the term Mistborn and Mistings don't exist. Whether or not the people that can use allomancy exist or not, no idea. But the terms don't exist yet. So hypothetically, then, my thought would be that those allomantic powers would be brought in with the mists at the same time. So pre-mist, maybe that still existed to a certain extent, a little bit.
Okay.
And the Lord Ruler, who we're talking about, because that's definitely who's writing these, and I know that for sure.
I'm 100% positive it's Lord Ruler.
is a user of Atium. And like I mentioned before, is using that to feign godhood, or feign, not godhood, but feign
Messiah.
Divineness?
Yeah.
Divinity?
Yeah. Divinity. Right. Messiahhood. Yeah.
Messiahhood. I like the term Messiahhood.
What else do you call like a Messiah, right? Like it's
Masonic?
Yeah, okay. But Masonic,
the Masonic Temple.
All right. But that's different.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, but sort of faking the ability to see the future through the use of Atium would be a great way to become a Messiah. That's
in your grander context, right, of like what Atium could be. And again, I've also titled this chapter Atium the Chapter, which it seems to also fit in that kind of
seems
like
fitting. We also have the point where earlier I think Kelsier seemed to be very, very confident that the Lord Ruler is not a Mistborn, right?
Okay. Yes. Was it that?
I thought that's what was said.
I think that might be right.
Whether or not it's true, I feel like Kelsier made that assertion.
Right.
So if that, going off that, supposing he's right in that, the Lord Ruler could be what we currently know as a misting that uses Atium exclusively. And maybe that is
Atium misting.
Yeah. Just
an
something.
Atium misting.
So
yeah.
Atium misting. But like I said, that term is intrinsically tied to the mists, and I feel like the mists are new with the rise of the Lord Ruler based on some context things about the stars and stuff like that. So
okay.
I don't know,
dude. I'm so glad. Like part of my wonder with this series is sort of these questions, right? And the way that this book series makes you consistently question the things that you know, which feels like a very kind of faith-inspired thing, where it's like you experience reality in the way that you're understanding it, and then faith in a lot of ways throws you questions against or for reality, and so then you interrogate reality, and that's this book series to me in its own way. Yeah, cool. All right, I'm good. That was great. I'm so glad that we now get to spend this time being like, not going from I don't fucking know what the shit that means to now like I have an idea, which is much better for everyone's sake. Which is great. And again, on the beginning of next episode, we will address kind of your thoughts on the previous sections and sort of readdressing them given your current information. So,
right.
We start off this chapter by discussing the implications of being noticed by Lord Elend Venture with Renew and Kelsier, as well as other details from the ball. What did you make of the discussion that they share?
Man, it just seemed too innocent.
Oh.
What do you mean, oh?
No, I just didn't expect that answer, so I said, oh. It's not crazy. It was just,
like,
oh.
It was just too clean of a conversation. There was no... I would have expected that conversation to happen after already getting to know somebody a little bit, at least. So I just don't trust it. I don't trust the conversation in general. Okay. So discussing the implications.
You just seem to not trust Renew whatsoever.
Oh, no, sorry. I'm still on the conversation with Elend Venture. I don't trust him.
Well, okay, I'm talking about the conversation about Elend.
You're talking about the conversation about the conversation.
Yes, right.
Different things.
Yes.
Okay. I think they...
So they're interrogating what you were commenting on not trusting.
Yeah, and they seem to kind of not be that disturbed by the context of the conversation or the content of the conversation, but more about the fact that this is the heir to this the most powerful family in the city, and therefore eyes are going to be on her more so than before, which is a fair thing to be worried about. But they don't really get into the content so much.
Yes, right. They don't really get into the depths. It's more about the kind of contextual things that it is dealing with this high-profile lord, of which we get in the very beginning of the previous chapter. We get the ranking of the houses, and Venture is the number 1 house.
But we knew that before, because Kelsier asks who's on top, and Declan answers...
Doxson, yeah.
Doxson, sorry. I don't know why I said Declan. Who's Declan?
You're thinking about Blade Runner already.
I've never seen Blade Runner.
What?
No, I haven't.
Dude, how are we friends? My God. All right, we're going to move on from that real quick, and we're going to go back to what we were just talking about a second ago, which is ultimately Doxson, Ellen Venture, in the ranking of the Venture household. So, yes, Venture is said to be on top. Yes, it's then repeated, and we get rankings from Sazed to Vin, and Vin is kind of the audience surrogate. Again, wow.
Sorry.
It's fine. At the beginning, I was shocked about Spider-Man, and
that'll change next week, right? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, in theory, it does, but on top of that, it changes because, oh dear God, are we talking about Spider-Man or Blade Runner? Are you talking
Blade
about
Runner?
Yeah, okay, you're gonna see Blade Runner. I was thinking more about Spider-Man. I can't believe that you haven't seen Spider-Man 2. Oh, I'm still in shock. Okay, anyway, yeah, so getting back to it, there's an obvious problem with him being from the wealthiest house here.
Yeah, a few of them.
Neat
Problems.
All right. Well, we've had a long conversation about that. That's kind of skirted around the whole issue. We're going to move on. After Kelsier takes off into the night and Vin pursues, she notices that he's somehow going much faster, further the blue line kind of fading out in the distance, and finds that Kelsier, or someone else, has built a secret Mistborn road leading to Luthadel using ingots laid on the ground. I've always thought of kind of, again, I actually wrote this before I saw Spider-Man today, so this feels really odd to be talking about it in context, but, you know, like, you think about Spider-Man and the logistical nightmare that his powers would be outside of New York City, right? Like, if he were stuck in fucking Alaska, the dude would be near worthless. Like, he would not have a good time in Alaska. But
he, like,
in New York,
crawls onto subways and, like, gets to his locations, right? Like, that's why it'd be tough.
Yeah, he uses subways. He like swings between buildings. No, he actually does use subways though. That's not a joke.
I'm fucking
I know
with
you thought it was a fucking joke, but like it's actually a real thing. But like I'm not. You think it's a joke. So to this point, this feels like a solution for kind of that problem, right? In its own way, where it's like you don't have metal if there's a forest between city to city. Right? Like, you don't have good things to pull on and move between and get you from location to location. And this feels like an elegant solution to that problem.
Yeah. Despite having only seen a little bit of Spider-Man, I
fucking hate you.
Aware of Spider-Man.
PJ has seen the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man and Civil War. Can we all just mock that for a moment?
I've also, like...
Thank you.
All right. Well...
No, that was the mock time.
All of
You're
you.
Good.
I genuinely, visually, the idea of this sort of thing, I was imagining inverse Spider-Man. So,
which is, I mean, fairly accurate in its own way. Like,
yeah.
I mean, obviously pushing instead of pulling themselves, you know, from, like, it's an interesting dance. And I think even in the very first chapter that we read this week, chapter 9, Vin talks about it as an interesting, like, half gait, where it's like pushing and pulling is between walking and sprinting in its own way, where it's like you are kind of like shoving yourself in this kind of odd gated step. And this feels like just an extension of that idea. Yeah. Feels like how, like, a train could work. You know, like a train powered by a Mistborn. You don't need a steam engine. You just need a dude.
You just need a bunch of dudes enslaved into, like, being tied to the...
Or hired and paid a reasonable wage.
Do you think they're going to be hired to be tied to a train track or to a train car?
I'm not suggesting underneath, but I mean, I feel your point hardcore in my soul. So I'm gonna just let that pass and sink into oblivion. So thank God we had this conversation about all of this. So after catching up, of course, inside of Luthadel, this quick trip between the two that is much faster than like a horse ride, which is crazy to Vin. There's this quick game of cat and mouse between the two. Kelsier ultimately catches Vin using the same trick that we talked about earlier, dropping the coin pouch. And Kelsier then in turn shares with Vin a little bead of liquid metal. It's Atium, a metal that seemingly projects the future to allow Mistborn to react to the next most likely outcome. What do you think of this shit?
So what I really appreciated about this was A, the way it was described, like the way the powers were described, but B, the logic behind all of it. By shorthand, it seems, and I think I even used it earlier, to say that you can see the future to a certain extent. And I will probably continue to refer to it as much or as such, just because it's easier to say that instead of talking about the probabilities of what paths are most likely for that individual. But from here on out, and what I'm talking about in general, that is shorthand. Seeing the future will be shorthand for me because that's just easier to say. But it creates this really elegant way of defeating it as well in that same sort of set of logic, in that if you can both see the next most likely outcome, you are both influenced by the other person's understanding of the next most likely outcome, and it just spirals and devolves into uncertainty. So it just annihilates itself as far as a upper hand goes. Super cool.
Interesting, especially to think about it that way. As two Mistborns fighting together, it reminds me of like in its own way, again, and this feels like an interesting, like kind of dated response, but it feels like a superhero team up, right? Where it's like the people have fought together long enough where they know each other's skill set and they do different things because they predict what the next person is going to do. Instead, we have a very literal representation of that where if Kelsier and Vin were to like side by side burn these things, they could see the next steps and then react, a la like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, of which gives like physical projections of like what the next move is going to be to like show you where they're going to like move through in a very unique way. And it reminds me of that kind of action movie moments. But in addition, when they're burning the metal against each other and that annihilation, like you mentioned, the constructive and destructive interference almost is so interesting.
It's interesting, but I think the most interesting thing about it is it doesn't actually have a unique interaction with somebody else that has Atium burning. It's just that there is constantly changing decisions being made.
Right.
And that just means that prediction is impossible because the prediction is based on the other person's understanding of what's happening. And it is entirely a conundrum.
A gambit, some might say.
I don't think that's right.
Well, if you have to make a choice, it's a gambit. A conundrum becomes a gambit.
I was kind of trying to describe it from the perspective of the Atium itself, which was abstract and not
from the
that
Atium,
great.
Yeah. But from the Mistborn user, like the individual sees this projection. It reminds me in its own way as well of, and this is again pre this movie that I'm going to mention, but Inception, in the way that it thinks about like the way that people project themselves over like distances and things like that. It reminds me of when like millions of different paths split out of people and they can all take these different kind of like moments and paths. And we see that sort of image in the mirror mind. It reminds me of that in which we see like these ghosts walking in different directions and sort of the infinite of another Mistborn's perception. And like trying to judge them. It's such, and this is why it gets a whole fucking chapter in its own right. Like it deserves a chapter to explain the way that this works.
So the one thing that it says a couple times, but doesn't give the logic behind, like we get the reason behind it, but we don't get the logic behind how it works. And it's kind of the only thing so far as Allomancy goes, is just the tack on. So the fact that it changes your ability to process things. It increases your ability to understand, like it increases your brain activity to understand what's happening. And it doesn't give any further logic behind that, other than you need to in order to be able to parse what you're seeing.
Right. And I think that's exactly the point, is in order to even understand the projections, you would also need to have your brain be able to understand it. And that feels like a given explanation to ensure that it's kind of like foolproofing in some way, I think. Like it's saying that basically, like, regardless of what you think might be going on in the brain chemistry has to be able to adjust to accept this new information.
So, yes, I agree. It's foolproofing to an extent, but I think what it's also doing is setting up a situation where Atium can be used for just increased intelligence and increased brain function, as opposed to strictly predicting movement.
It's interesting that you'd think that, man.
Yeah,
that's cool. I'm so glad you feel wired into the series to me in a big way,
dude. I love this. I love this shit.
Yeah.
Like, this is so grounded and rooted and seems to be following a very, very strict logic for the most part, that, like, this is resonating with me perfectly.
Cool. With that, the last note of the week before we go into kind of our final journal entry is he shares this, of course, this knowledge, this understanding of Atium before daring to go into a crazy task next week, which is that of sneaking into Creedic Shaw, the Lord Ruler's stronghold. What do you think about what we're going to see next week?
I really appreciated Vin's persistence throughout this entire, like, scene. And she makes a really good point that I want to highlight, and I'm not going to really give any sort of insight beyond what she actually already said, but the fact that he keeps saying he has to wait until she's ready, and she feels like she's never going to be ready in his eyes, on top of the fact that he's always talking about how much of a boon it is to have two Mistborns, and she's never being utilized as a Mistborn. So, like, those two things are perfectly appealing to Kelsier's, like, his sense of self and what he's saying. And, like, yes, I said those things, and I want to be true to what I say. So, yeah, come along. I don't think that's exactly what's going on here in his mind, but I'm sure that's a part of it. But
there's an element of truth, yeah.
Either way, I think she makes good points. Even if it's not based on any sort of manipulation, which I don't think that's the intention, but I thought it was a fun spin to put on it. I don't think that she was intending to manipulate him, but more so just point out the hypocrisy of him saying all these things and then not letting her come along.
Okay, cool, man. I'm super excited week over week that you are still so invested and dug in on a lot of these things with this book in the series. So very excited. We of course end this week with a very little prophecy here. It's not that little, but it's our final prophecy of the week going into chapter 14. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going mad. Perhaps it is due to the pressure of knowing that I must somehow bear the burden of an entire world. Perhaps it is caused by the death I have seen, the friends I have lost, the friends I have been forced to kill. Either way, I sometimes see shadows following me, dark creatures that I don't understand nor wish to understand. Are they perhaps some figment of my overtaxed mind? And what are your thoughts into next week?
These are definitely the writings of the Lord Ruler. More and more, I'm convincing myself of that. And I'm either going to feel really dumb when it comes time to, like, prove me wrong, or really dumb when I look back and say, like, how the fuck did I not see this earlier? It's going to be one of those things. Either way, I'm going to feel dumb.
No.
I'm prepared for that. But whatever he did, and I guess I'm going off of this supposition that the mists were also a part of the Lord Ruler's ascension to prominence, whatever that means.
To the throne, or what have you. Yeah.
So I feel like that also brought the mists, and I guess I can't exactly explicitly recall where that was said, if it was said at all, but that's what's in my mind. So whatever brought the mists also brought the mist wraiths that we've already been introduced to, and I can only imagine are the dark creatures that he's talking about.
All right, man. Yeah. I love that prediction. I think that's a great way to go into kind of next and thinking about all the different things that we have to kind of talk about and focus on. So, all right. With this, we will move into our question of the week. PJ, what was the question of the week?
What is your favorite prologue?
What is your favorite prologue? So we have a number of answers here, mostly from patrons over the course. And again, next week's question is going to be identical just because we want to ensure that we get everyone's answers in over the course of our kind of elongated and odd recording schedule. So no new question, same question, but we're going to read a couple of answers today. So PJ, do you have a favorite prologue? Top of your head? Do you want to think
here's
about it?
What we're going to do. Because as Crossland knows, up until today, just now, like a couple hours ago, I've been working on finals. So I'm going to give my favorite prologue next week.
Cool. All right. We'll lead off with some patrons' favorites. So from Artificer, Dragon Mount, The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. This is a really great one. It leads in and explains kind of the breaking of the world that happened at the end of the last cycle of the Wheel of Time, and it is such a good introduction in large to the fantasy of this science fiction dystopian fantasy world that it breaks a lot of expectations, and I think it is a very good example of a prologue. I may have even gone so far as to choose it myself if I didn't have a slightly stronger example, but that's a great one.
Okay.
Right.
Cool. So Lex from the Discord. Didn't some random new character die like every single Game of Thrones prologue? LOL. Always found it funny. I think that's entirely true. I'm pretty sure. As far as the TV shows go.
Have you read GOT prologue? Like any?
I'm just thinking like early, like first episode of every season. So I was approaching that as the prologue.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, and that's a fair point.
People die early in the seasons pretty regularly. Maybe not the first one, but
we did open this up wide to say, like, if you can think of a TV show that has a prologue or a movie that has a prologue wherein someone dies, like, definitely mention it. So, opened up wide 1 and 2 that we had recommended 2 different times here from Sharkbait and Ivana is that of the Iron Gold prologue by Pierce Brown. And I cannot help but agree. It is a fantastic prologue. It's got this interesting poetic wave to it that makes each paragraph feel distinct and unique in its own right. So
that one's really good.
It's really good. It's really good. To finalize our short list here that we also have from Zeph Hawaiian, of course, Dark Age prologue fucking rips, bro, and could not agree more. As I thought about this, I can't believe that my brain skipped over the Dark Age prologue, because the Dark Age prologue is brutal and grim. It does so much in so little time, and yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one to beat.
Yeah, it is.
I will adjust, though, and match that with my own favorite prologue. You're doing yours next week. I'm going to do mine this week. My favorite prologues are those of the Greenbone Saga's prologues. So starting with Jade City, Jade War, and Jade Legacy, there is a character in the very first book, and I'm going to talk about that prologue specifically, named Barrow, of whom introduces this entire fantastical world through his lens, in which he is attempting to pull a heist on Greenbones, who are effectively gang members inside of this interesting mob society, and is trying to pull this heist, and they've got has this kind of like magical element attached to them where Jade powers their abilities. And so we get a good taste of the world, we get a good taste of the magic system, and we get a taste of sort of the nonchalance and indifference of this character Barrow right off the bat, and it is so good. I love Barrow chapters, and I've gushed about my love for the Greenbone Saga. It was my personal pull for reading it over Mistborn, but all told, very glad that we're reading Mistborn, but I highly recommend to anyone who is interested in anything like this to read The Greenbone Saga if they haven't yet. It starts with Jade City, Jade War, and then Jade Legacy, but it's so fucking good.
I have been seeing a whole lot of that series like on our Instagram and stuff, just because I think it's topical.
Yep.
At this point, right? Like
the third book at this point, when we're recording this 2.5 weeks ago. So it's very topical.
Right. So very topical, but also sounds really interesting. Would it be fair of me to think that we will cover this at some point?
I would like to. However, I would also say that this is one that I would maybe say you could read on your own.
Yeah, but also I don't have time to read things on my own, Crossland.
I know you don't yet, but I think you will in 6 months, and I think you might want to. And I would pitch this one up as a potential read on your own, and then maybe we do like a discussion episode once you're done with each book or something like that. It is a fantastic series that I love to death. I think I talked about it inside of our Discord. Again, you can join our Discord, patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey. But I cried in this final book 5 or 6 times. And I am not generally so moved by prose so as to leak from my face. And it genuinely like hit me in ways that I never believed that prose could. Jade Legacy is one of my favorite books of all time, like top 10 favorite books of all time. And I realized that I've turned the end of this episode talking about prologues into like a whole pitch for this whole thing. But dear God, if you haven't read or considered the series, give it a go. It's going to be adapted into a TV show on Peacock, bought the rights, sold, producers attached, writers, everything. It will be a TV show in the near future. And it will be amazing because the books are amazing. There's no world in which you don't adapt this perfectly because of how brilliantly Fondly has written it. So, them's the feels, and I just added a little rant on the end of this episode.
No,
I think it was worth
good.
it. I think if anyone needed a pitch on a new series to tackle, that was it. And if for whatever reason you're already through Mistborn, you're listening to us in post, you've read Red Rising, you've read a number of things, this is in my... It'll be coming out in January at this point, but I recorded a video talking about recommendations post Red Rising. This is in my top 3. This is my second pick for recommendations post Red Rising. So definitely go give it a fucking read.
For sure.
Yeah. You can't though, because you're fucked and cuckolded to whatever I tell you to.
I mean... All right, let's talk about...
put it that way.
Let's talk once again about like the entire point of this show.
Right.
In that it was to force me to read more. Mm-hmm. Or force me to read, period. I don't have a whole lot of time to read otherwise.
It is a series that I so want to get to, but I fear that given our current list, I don't know if we'll get to it while it's relevant. So...
Yeah, but does it have to be relevant if you still love it?
No, I fucking adore it. And that's the reality. And I would definitely talk about it at length. But
like, yeah, fair. I mean, if somebody just bought the rights to the TV show, let's talk about this for a second.
We actually do talk about adaptation, quite a bit.
We talk about adaptation quite a bit, but if somebody just bought the rights to the show, that's going to be a couple of years, maybe.
They bought it a year ago, so they've actually been in development for a year now. And actually, it's not just bought the rights; it's that they have a writer and director attached, and they're like almost pre-production in casting phase.
Okay,
so
I have no idea what that close. Sort of timeline is, but if it's like
probably another 6 months to a year until filming, maybe.
Okay. So I think that timeline works out pretty well for us to start tackling the book.
Potentially. That also
before around the release of the TV show.
That also leans on us believing that Peacock is going to do a good enough job.
Peacock does a pretty good job with AP Bio, and that's the only thing I know from Peacock, so...
Well, and I mean, like, it's not as though it's a bad streaming service. It's just a new one,
no,
right? Like, Halo is coming out of Paramount Plus, right? Like another streaming service. We love and believe in Halo. How many of our friends do you think are going to pay for Paramount Plus to watch Halo?
They won't.
I won't. Precisely none.
Maybe we close it out.
So with that, next question of the week is, again, send us in your final thoughts on prologues. Anything else that might surround your opinion on prologues and the stories they're in, we will cover in the 5th episode. After that, we'll be moving on to a new question of the week. That's actually next week's our halfway point in this book, PJ.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I've mentioned our guest to a number of patrons.
Have you mentioned it to me?
Do you know who our guest is?
No.
We had requests from patrons, fans alike, for us to bring in other friends that we have who aren't necessarily like bookish community members or anything like that. And so I figured there was no better way to kick off this series with one of our friends, of whom read the book very recently upon a recommendation and enjoys it. And so we are going to have Lindsay Lundeen come on and chat with us about the end of Mistborn.
Awesome. That'll be great.
Yeah. Lindsay's great. She's also going to be on that,
wonderful.
That fun bonus episode.
Yeah.
That we're doing that I haven't talked about yet. But she will be an absolute asset, and I'm very excited to kind of proceed from that point. I think that the way that we've chatted about the book so far, it's going to be so. With that, next week we are going to be covering chapters 14 through 19. Again, it's a similarly length section. It'll be about that like kind of 80-ish page mark inside the paperback. Very excited to kind of chat about the contents therein. Should be a fun time, folks.
Yes.
So that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, of course, to Tim and Andrew, our producers, for helping us make this whole thing run. You can check out all of our links in the show notes. You can find the schedule, Patreon, previous episodes, websites, drinks. Those are on the websites. Social media accounts, all in one very convenient location. Wait, I got my next thing.
Oh, yeah. Right, sure.
If you don't want to look in the show notes because you're lazy like I am, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at WordsWhiskeyPod. And if you want to send anything to us via email, be that predictions for me to answer or whatever questions, literally anything. We love getting emails from listeners. wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com. And if you are interested in supporting us through our Patreon, that is patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey.
And again, of course, if you are unable to give via Patreon or what have you, a review means the world to us. If you're able to write a review, leave us a 5-star. And any other show that you support inside of any podcast you listen to, go ahead and do that on Apple Podcasts and or the platforms you listen to. It is critical.
It is bonkers how important it is to like actually getting like onto the feeds of like recommended for other people that haven't already heard of us. Like, it's wild how important 5-star reviews are. So
it is wild how important those reviews are. And I don't know if a number of shows have put it into that context, but that is actually what we've seen in terms of kind of changes week over week, especially starting small to big. So any review that you can give any of the small shows that you enjoy and like and listen to, absolutely go ahead and do that on the platform of your choosing. It makes a massive difference. And can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. Anything else, Crossland?
No, man. I'm good. See you next week.
Yeah, see you guys next week. This is so much fun.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.